Hey class, and welcome to the next chapter. We are now on chapter 12. Chapter 12 is all about production and growth. Have you ever really wondered about different societies and how we measure their wealth and how we can improve our wealth, our income, our standard of living, and how do we grow these economies? So for instance, taking into example this nice little typical family living in the UK. UK would be considered an advanced economy. And they have taken all their possessions and they've put them on their, I don't know, driveway, road. And you can see they've got quite a bit of possessions. They have a sailboat, they have kitchen appliances, they have a nice amount of furniture. The per capita GDP is in England is about 36. Now, granted, obviously, this is a few years ago. The infant mortality rate is 5%, and the high school enrollment is 98%. Now, compare that to a typical family in Mexico. This is all their possessions. They are considered to be a middle income country, and this is a typical family. Few more children. The GDP per capita is about 15,390. The infant mortality rate is 1.6%, quite a bit higher than the UK, and the high school enrollment is 71%. Now, here's a poor country. This is Mali. It's a poor country. There's a family with all its possessions out. Nice house. Their per capita income is a little over $1,000. The infant mortality rate is 17.6%, and the high school enrollment is 31%. You're starting to see some correlations there, aren't you? The per capita GDP, meaning, the GDP per capita, seems to be related to many other indications of productivity, such as enrollment in high school, which would, of course, help the labor force and education, and the population, the infant mortality rate. So we're going to be looking at those over the course of this class in this particular chapter. So, in fact, there's vast difference in the standard of living across the world. And incomes and growth around the world are very, very different. So if we were to look at the GDP per capita in 2012 for all major countries in the world, you'd see China's was really quite low, comparatively speaking to Singapore's, or Japan's, or Spain's, or the United States, or Canada, or New Zealand's, or Saudi Arabia. But when you look at the growth rate between 1970 and 2012, you see that even though that per capita seems to be a low number relative, they have grown immensely over that point in time. Whereas the United States, who has a fairly high per capita, only grew 1.8. And Canada, right next to us, is 1.7. So fact 2, there is a great variation in the growth across these countries. And this growth across countries we're going to be looking at in terms of what variables and how does a country grow their GDP per capita. So since growth rates vary and the country's rankings can change over time, we can't assume that just because you're a poor country today, you're necessarily doomed for poverty forever. In Singapore, incomes were very, very low in 1960. And as we saw, they're quite high now. Rich countries can't take their status for granted. They can be overtaken by poorer but faster growing countries. So why are some countries richer than others? Why do some countries grow quickly while other countries seem stuck in this poverty trap? What policies can help raise growth rates and long-run living standards? Productivity is the key. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. This ability depends on productivity, and that's the average quantity of goods and services produced per unit of labor input. So what are we talking about? It's the average quantity of goods and services produced, which we've been measuring over the last 2 chapters. We've been talking about ways of measuring goods and services per unit of labor. So now we're trying to see how productive the country is with its labor. So if we know the real GDP, which we have learned how to calculate, and we know the quantity of labor, how much labor there is available in the country, we can figure out that country's productivity. We can take Y, the real GDP, and divide it by the output per worker, and get the output per worker, So Y divided by the quantity of labor will give you productivity, or the output per worker. What we're trying to do is figure out for a society how productive each worker is. Output being the productivity. This is how much they're making, but we need to know how much is per worker. Otherwise, the numbers would kind of lie, wouldn't they? Because you could have a really high number, but when you looked at it and you looked at your population, if your population of laborers was even higher, then it would really not be that particularly good number, would it? So productivity, why is it so important? Why do we care? Well, we care because when a nation's workers are productive, the real GDP is large and incomes are high. When productivity grows rapidly, so do living standards. So what then is the determinants? What makes that GDP per labor grow? And what affects it? So over the course of looking at productivity, we're going to look at the variables that affect it, but we're also going to use an example of Robinson Crusoe because it's a nice simplistic example, but it's a great one. Robinson Crusoe is stranded on an island. He must catch his own fish, he has to grow his own vegetables, and he has to make his own clothes. So let's see how Robinson's going to do that. Physical capital per worker is the first variable we're going to look at in terms of productivity. And remember how we talked about physical capital is the stock of equipment and structures used to produce goods and services. This is what we call physical capital, or capital. In economic terms, we're talking about equipment and structures and inventories. And we denote that as K, physical capital. K divided by L, which we now know is what? Labor force. It gives us the capita per worker. Productivity is higher when the average worker has more capital. They have more machines, they have more equipment. So an increase in capital per worker will cause an increase in productivity, or Y divided by L, which is productivity. So let's look at Robinson Crusoe. We only have one laborer, don't we? So in order for him to increase his K divided by L, he needs to catch more fish with a fishing rod. Why? Because if he has a fishing rod, he will catch more fish. Otherwise, how is he going to catch those fish? He's going to have to use his hands. Any type of what? Physical capital, equipment that Robinson Crusoe uses will make him more efficient than he would have been otherwise. So Robinson Crusoe's productivity will increase by the use of K, a fishing rod, or any other capital, physical capital, and because he's L, is only Robinson Crusoe. So he will increase the overall productivity of his little economy by having fishing rods. So fishing rods in this particular case are physical capital per worker. Human capital per worker. Human capital, H, is the knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. If you take H and you divide it by L, you get the average worker's human capital. No great surprise, but productivity is higher when the average worker has more human capital, i.e. education and skills. So an increase in H over L will increase productivity, or Y over L. How does this affect Robinson Crusoe? Well, we know that Robinson Crusoe right now needs to catch fish. So he will catch more fish if he has been trained in the best fishing techniques or has gained experience fishing. What is being trained in fishing techniques or gaining experience? What measures that? It's human capital. It's knowledge. Knowledge has allowed Robinson Crusoe to increase his overall productivity, catch more fish. Natural resources per worker. Natural resources is denoted as N. It's the inputs into the production that nature provides. Land, mineral deposits, other things being equal, more N allows a country to produce more Y. In per worker terms, an increase in N divided by L increases Y divided by L. But there's a very key point to this. Some countries are rich because they have abundant natural resources. But you don't have to have abundant natural resources. You just have to import them. So we have two countries. Saudi Arabia is known for what? It has a lot of natural resources. It has a lot of oil. Japan, on the other hand, does not necessarily have a lot of natural resources. It is what they would call resource poor. However, Japan is trade rich. They trade a ton. So the Japanese economy over time has compensated for its lack of natural resources. It's a very small island by trading. In Robinson Crusoe's case, he'd have better luck catching fish if the natural resources around his island, otherwise known as fish, were plentiful. If they weren't, he's going to have a harder time, isn't he? Technology. All right. Technological knowledge is society's understanding of the best ways to produce a good and service. Now, technology progress does not only mean a faster computer or a higher definition TV or a smaller cell phone. It means any advanced knowledge that boosts productivity. So when Henry Ford first standardized an assembly line in the United States, he was advancing technical knowledge. Much of technical knowledge, for instance, from our space travel, was then used for society's understanding of the best way to produce other goods and services, even though originally it was used for the space shuttle or for the Apollo system or now for SpaceX. Many advances in knowledge are just basically allowing society to get more output from its resources. In the case of Robinson Crusoe, he would catch more fish if he has invented a better fishing lure. He has basically gained knowledge over time on what fishing lures work and what do not work and created a better fishing lure. So, what determines the U.S. standard of living? Well, one thing is our productivity, right? We've just talked about that. Productivity, the output per worker, is correlated or is associated with our standard of living. And what determines our productivity? Well, it's the amount of physical capital per worker. We just talked about that. The amount of human capital per worker. We talked about that. The amount of natural resources per worker. We talked about that. And the amount of technical knowledge. What about Robinson Crusoe? Well, he's just like our economy as a whole, as the U.S., Robinson Crusoe's economy's standard of living is directly associated to his productivity, his output per worker. And what determines his productivity? Well, the number of fishing poles, his physical capital, the amount of training, his human capital, the supply of fish, natural resources, and the invention of new fishing techniques, technical knowledge. So, what's the difference between technical knowledge and human capital? And technical knowledge refers to society's understanding of how to produce goods and services. Whereas human capital results from the efforts people expend to acquire this knowledge. So human capital takes the form of when we're learning how to do things. Once they become commonplace or they're used all over the place, they are now technical knowledge, but you needed the human capital to get to the technical knowledge. And both are very important for productivity because you have to constantly have the human capital who is gaining knowledge if you want to keep your technological knowledge going, right? Why do we do this? Remember back to chapter 2, how we talked about how economists model things as a way to show how the economy works in nice and easy terms. And one of the models that we're going to discuss in macro is the production function. And the production function is basically a graph or an equation, and we're showing an equation here that shows the relationship between outputs and inputs. So what is it saying? Y, which we now know is the GDP, the real GDP. We see A. A is the level of technology. Is a function. F is the function key. Everybody's got to remember back to algebra. So there's our little function key. Is a function of Y, the quantity of human labor. K, the quality of physical labor. H, human capital. N, natural resources. Notice A, he's over here all by himself. What is A doing? It's a multiplier. It's multiplying the function. So improvements in technology increase is A and allows the output to be produced in any combinations of inputs, right? It allows more. Why does it allow more? Because it's a multiplier. So any technology is going to basically have an effect on this entire function. Think about computers. When we had improvements in technology and we had computers that were easily to use, that were available to all, that were accessible, didn't require enormous rooms, we changed many of these variables. We changed physical capital. We changed human capital. And we could allocate our resources differently because we learned different technologies that helped us allocate our resources, different farming technologies, etc. We could monitor things differently from how we had ever done it before. That is one of the reasons why it's called the multiplier. Now, this production function has the property of constant returns of state. And if we all kind of put our heads back together and remember back to algebra, that means that if you do anything to this side, you do it what? You have the same change over on the side. So any change in inputs by the same percent cause the outputs to change by that percent. Any change to inputs by any percent will create the outputs to change. So by multiplying all the inputs by 2 causes the output to double. So if you multiply L, K, H, and N by 2, it will cause Y to double. And the same thing is true if you do 10%, etc. What's cool about this is we can multiply both sides by 1 over L. What is this? By doing this, we're getting output per worker. Right now, we're just talking about L, K, H, N. But if we want to know output per worker, we need to multiply everything by 1 over L. So if we take L, we multiply by 1 over L, we get 1. If we take K and we multiply by 1 over L, we get K over L, right? Because this would be K times 1 over L. Well, that's going to equal what? K over L. Do the same thing to H. You're going to get H over L. And N, which is going to give you N over L. Now, obviously, this is 1, so this just kind of goes away. So what you end up looking at is you say to yourself, the level of technology, which is your multiplier. You've got the physical capital per worker right here, the human capital per worker right here, the natural resources per worker, that's right there. And this equation shows that this productivity per worker or output per worker depends on what? Technology, physical capital per worker, human capital per worker, and natural resources per worker. Taking this a step further, we can look to see economic growth and public policy. And we can kind of look at what public policy does to affect the long-term growth in productivity and living standards. So here's some public policies that we look at. Public policies involving investment and savings. We can boost the productivity by increasing K, which is the physical capital. Now, physical capital requires that people invest in factories and invest in the physical capital. If resources are scarce, producing more capital means that you've got to trade off by producing less consumption goods. If you think about it in terms of a factory, if the factory wants to buy a new machine, it has to decrease the amount of output it's doing in order to do what? Spend some money on that machine instead of on the inputs that go into those particular outputs. So, vice versa, if we reduce our consumption, we as an economy then save more. So, simplistically put, if you don't buy a car and you put that money into savings, you increased savings and reduced consumption. These extra increases in savings cost extra funds that then can be used by different firms to produce goods. And we're going to look at this a lot more in next chapter. Hence, there's a trade-off between today and the future. I think you all probably already realize that, right? The diminishing returns and catch-up effect. So the government can implement a policy that raises savings and investment. And when the government does that, they increase K because there's more savings in the system, and more savings then in turn has more money in the banks. More money in the banks means banks have more money to lend. Banks lend more money to businesses. Businesses buy capital. This rise in K increases the productivity and the living standards. But this growth is very temporary because of the diminishing returns of capital. As K rises, the extra output from the additional units of K falls. It diminishes over time. Now, what kind of policies would a government do that would raise savings and investments? Well, let's think about it. Government policies have to do with things like tax breaks and other types of incentives. So a tax break would be something, for instance, about deferring the amount of tax you have to pay on your 401k until after retirement. We are encouraging people to save today for the future. So what was that diminishing return thing I'm talking about? Yeah, you were like, what are you talking about? I know. So if you say this is your capital per worker, and this is physical capital. So there's your physical capital per worker. And here is your the productivity, your output per worker. So right here marks one spot on the curve. And in this spot on the curve, you have this much capital to work with, and you have this much productivity. If a worker have little capital and you give them some more, in other words, you increase it up to this point, what happens? Their productivity rises quite a bit, doesn't it? It rises a lot more. So this difference here, by giving them a little more K, rose their productivity quite a bit, didn't it? However, if a group of workers are way out here, so they've got quite a bit of capita, and their productivity is over here, then if you increase it, if you go over here and you increase it and you say, okay, this is where I'm going to be, look what happens. You only get a little increase in your productivity because the workers already have a lot of K to work with. So giving them more increases their productivity, but fairly little. This is the diminishing returns. So what we're saying is over time, the additional capital is not necessarily increasing the productivity. So you have to know what to use and where to use it. So this is why it's called the catch-up effect. Remember when we were talking about countries and we were saying, okay, if you're a poor country, we know you're probably somewhere here. You've got a little bit of capital per worker and your productivity per worker is okay. We know that if you increase the capital per worker available, a poor country can increase their output per worker quite a bit. But a rich country, starting here, if they increase their capital per worker, they only end up increasing their productivity a little bit. So a poor country can gradually increase their capital per worker and increase their productivity and catch up with a rich country. So what it says is that just because you're a poor country and your capital per worker and your Y per worker, your output per worker is low, doesn't mean that you can't, by investing in capital per worker, you can't catch up. Singapore. So, countries that have done this. Between 1960 and 1990, the US and Korea devoted a similar share of GDP to investment. So we basically did the same thing. If you were to look at capital per labor and you were looking to increase this distance here, they were exactly the same. However, the growth in Korea was quite a bit larger than the growth in the US. Why was that? Because of the catch-up effect. In 1960, Korea was way over here. So that little effect, the same amount, got them a huge growth here, whereas the US was already over here. So that little change only got them that much. The catch-up effect. Over time, Korea could move themselves right over. So how do you raise K over L? This is where economics and foreign policy really start to intertwine, because by investing abroad, you can change K over L for another economy. And thus you can increase the productivity, the wages, and the living standards. And by doing so, you literally are changing an economy. And the government can encourage this. And how do governments encourage this? By direct foreign investment. They encourage, in this case, the US citizens to make a capital investment in a factory or something that is owned and operated by a foreign entity. We did a lot of this, by the way, in China. We also did foreign portfolio investments. It's a capital investment financed with foreign money, but operated by its domestic residents. So we literally gave money into a portfolio of things going on, but the domestic residents use that money accordingly. Some of the returns from these investments flow back into us, our country, right? Because we supply goods, we're probably supply funds, we're probably getting interest, etc. And especially poor countries that can't generate enough savings to do anything about this K over L number. They can't get enough investment money to make this K get larger. These types of funding really work themselves. So they can't get the savings to fund the investments themselves, but they can if we invest by portfolio or directly. I believe Apple is a direct investment. So you can also help poor countries by learning state-of-the-art technologies. What was that? Does anybody remember? That was that multiplier effect, wasn't it? And that would multiply all the variables on the side, wouldn't it? Education. As a country, and its government increases productivity by promoting education, the investment in H. Why is that so darn important? Because H over L is one of the functions of the equation. So when you increase H by public schools, by loans for college, you're making that H variable, H over L, larger. And as we know, as H over L goes up, what happens? Y over L goes up. Each year of education raises a worker's wages. In the United States, each year of schooling raises your wages about 10% on average. By investing in H, human capital, you are making a trade-off. So a country has to consciously say, we're going to take the money and put it into something we're not going to see a direct effect from right now, but we're going to see it in the future. Because what happens? You're sacrificing. And the countries are sacrificing as well as the individuals. Each spending year in school, each year that's spent in school, is sacrificing a year's wages. And I think you've all made that calculation. But the country has to do so as well. Health and nutrition. Health expenditures, healthcare, is a type of investment in human capital. Why? Because if the human capital is healthier, they're more productive. In countries with significant malnutrition, raising the workers' caloric intake has increased productivity quite a bit. 1962 to 1995, the caloric consumption rose 44% in Korea, and economic growth has been enormous. This all comes, believe it or not, from a Nobel Prize winner who looked at the rate of growth in Britain from 1790 to 1980, and he attributed 30% of it purely to nutritional improvements. Property rights and political stabilities. Remember back to the political theories we talked about in chapter 1? Markets are a good way to organize economic activity. Well, markets require that there's a price system that allocates the resources to their most effective uses. This requires a respect for property rights. Without property rights, you need the ability to exercise authority over the resources they own. If they cannot exercise authority over the resources they own, then they have no stability in terms of their property. And guess what happens? People who don't believe they have any control over what happens to their property are less likely to take risks and or use this. So in many countries with poor justice systems that just don't work very well, contracts aren't always enforced. Fraud and corruption goes unpunished, and firms can bribe officials. Because of these types of issues, it creates uncertainty on whether property rights will be protected in the future. And thus, people are not willing to make direct or indirect investments into those countries because they're investing into those things that they may not be protected. So when people fear that their capital may be stolen or worse, even maybe confiscated, there's less investment. So no money from abroad, and people who live there are more likely to move their money abroad. This makes living standards lower. So economic stability, knowing your economy is stable, making sure it's efficient, making sure there's a justice system, and healthy growth of law enforcement, courts, stable constitution, and honest government officials go a long way to people wanting to invest. Free trade. Free trade is a way in which all countries can increase their productivity. Inward-oriented policies on free trade, like tariffs and limits on investment from abroad, are aimed to increase the living standards by avoiding interaction with other countries. Outwardly oriented trade policies, limiting restrictions, on trade and foreign investment, promote a world economy. Well, what does this mean? Remember how I said trade made everybody better off when we talked about that? Well, trade has a similar effect to discovering a new policy technology. It promotes productivity and living standards. So countries that have inwardly oriented policies generally fail to create growth. Argentina did this in the 20th century. Countries that have outwardly oriented policies often succeed. South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. What about research and development? Well, we talked about technology, and technology progress is one of the main reasons why living standards rise in the long run. And we know that one of the reasons is that knowledge is a public good and should be shared freely. So once you have that human capital and you have those people learning and they have knowledge and they go out and they work and the knowledge gets disseminated through the society as a public good, it increases the productivity. But you have to basically reward somebody for creating these great and wonderful new inventions. Because otherwise, what is the incentive? So patent laws help people feel as though they're going to be getting some reward for their particular invention or their particular technology progress is going to help everybody. Tax incentives and direct support for R&D is another way that we make people want to invent and to be entrepreneurial. And grants that we give universities to go out and think of new and different things. These are all ways in which we are creating knowledge. And knowledge becomes this public good that we can all use. Population growth. It affects your standard of living in 3 ways. It stretches natural resources. 200 years ago, an economist by the name, I guess he was an economist, Malthus, argued that population growth would strain society's ability to promote for itself. So he basically said that this was going to be our downcoming fall. This was going to happen. So since then, the population has grown 6-fold. And in theory, Malthus was right. Our living standards would have fallen, but they rose because he failed to account for the technological progress and productivity growth that would occur because of it. So he was purely looking at the allocation of resources across a population, a labor force, and he wasn't looking at the other factors that could have influenced it. The bigger the population, clearly the larger L, and that dilutes your capital stock. It dilutes K over L, and this applies to H as well. So what ends up happening is you have lower productivity and living standards because you have a larger population. It also dilutes H. It's a greater strain on the educational system if there's more people in it. So countries with faster growing populations tend to have lower education allowance. They tend to say, okay, my population is growing largely. You don't have to go to school through high school, 12th grade, I believe. You can go through 10th. But what's happening then? By doing so, you are decreasing the H denominator. So your H is going down and your L is going up. So this is going up, but this is going down. So how do you combat that? Many countries have used policies to control population growth. Ones that have been very controversial is the one-child policy in China. Other ones are things like contraceptive and education and availability and allowing people to make choices. One of the other ones that helps with population growth is literacy of females. By increasing the opportunity cost of having babies, because females have other options other than purely having children, you do tend to dilute the human capital stock. I'm sorry, you tend not to dilute the human capital stock. In other words, what happens is that you've got K over L, but now L isn't rising quite as fast as it once was because women now have other options. So L rises at this point rate versus the other. This has decreased this pull on the K. So many times, and a lot of US policies have been around the notion of moving countries out of poverty by increasing the female half of the population's literacy, allowing them other opportunities to grow and to expand their knowledge, increasing the human capital as well as decreasing the L. Promoting technology. So if you have more people who are scientists, inventors, and engineers, you have more frequent discoveries. If you have more frequent discoveries, you have faster technology process. So over human history, growth rates increase as the world's population does increase. And the more populated areas grew faster than the less populated areas, as long as they had not only L was growing, but what else was growing? Education. So as long as people were able to get the education to become scientists, inventors, and engineers, the population growth worked in their advantage because they had more scientists, inventors, engineers. So let's review the concepts. Productivity has some determinants. K over L is the human capital per worker. H over L is the human capital per worker. N over L is the natural resources per worker, and A is the technological knowledge. What do we know about these? We know that each one of them has policies that help raise these determinants. So what are some determinants, policies that raise each of these determinants? Well, if you were to list 3, I have 4 or 5 here, so we go through 5. Encouraging savings and investment will raise what? Well, it'll raise K. And if you raise K, then this number rises, right? If you encourage investment from abroad, investment will increase K. K, then this rises. If you promote public education, now H will rise. If H rises, this will rise. If you have patent laws, then people are more willing to be involved in technology. And if you grow your population, you will also control your population growth. You can also increase this. This one's a controversial one because, as I showed you, there are 2 arguments to this, correct? There is the argument that population growth is okay because you're going to get more scientists, but you have to be promoting the public education involved and have the investment if you're going to have the population growth. Otherwise, you want to keep your K-L relationship pretty similar. So, are natural resources a limit to growth? Some argue that, yeah, we're depleting our resources and we should limit them. Populations shouldn't grow. And because populations are growing, our natural resources are depleting and we're limiting our ability to grow everybody's living standards. But technological process helps us sometimes avoid these. For instance, we have hybrid cars that use less gas. That's a natural resource we're using less of. Better insulation in our homes reduces energy required to heat and cool. As resources become scarcer, its market price rises, and it causes an incentive to conserve it and develop alternatives. Remember how we talked about economics is all about incentives? So if all of a sudden the price of things becomes higher, people start to try to find solutions around it. And when they start to find solutions around it, they're looking at an incentive to find a way around it. So to summarize, here's our equation. Remember, it's beautiful. What was this? Productivity. It's a function of 1, which is basically labor over labor, KL, HL, NL, with a multiplier. What's the multiplier? Technology, research and development. What are the things that we talked about with this? We talked about that savings and investment can increase this K over L. We talked about the catch-up effect, that countries that have lower K over L can clearly move themselves up quite quickly in terms of productivity. We talked about investment abroad is a quick way to increase K over L. And we talked about free trade as being a positive. With H, we talked about education and educational policies as being essential. And the health and nutrition also are key to increasing H, which then, of course, increases H over L. A is all about research and development. It's all about allowing people to do what? To use and to feel like they have the right to research, develop, that their thoughts will be taken and respected, and you're going to have some political stability as well. Okay, to summarize, there are really large differences across countries in terms of standard of living. We looked at 3 at the very beginning. Do you remember them? They were Mexico, they were the UK, and they were Mali. The productivity per unit of labor is the main determinant on the standard living standards in the long run. This productivity depends on human, physical capital, and human capital, natural resources, all per worker. I'm sorry. Let's try it again. Productivity depends on physical and human capital per worker, natural resources per worker, and technological knowledge, the multiplier. Growth in these factors, especially technological progress, can cause growth in the living standards over the long run. Policies that affect the growth are what? Savings and investment, international trade, education, health, and nutritional policies, property rights and political stability, resource development, population growth. And because of the diminishing returns of capital, growth from investment eventually slows down, and poor countries can catch up with rich ones. So there is always hope. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a great week. Remember, if you have any questions, contact me. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon.